So here's the thing. At first, this whole situation didn't seem that unusual. It honestly felt like just another story people would talk about for a few days and then move on from. But the more you actually look into it, the more it starts to feel off. Small details don't quite match up. Timelines feel a little inconsistent, and suddenly what looked simple on the surface turns into something much more complicated. At the center of all of this is Jim Bob Duggar, someone who, for years, has been known for running his family in a very controlled and structured way. And if you've followed anything about the Duggar family before, you probably already know that control has always been a big part of how things operate behind the scenes. But what's coming out now suggests it goes much deeper than most people ever realized. A lot of this starts to make more sense when you bring in what Jill Duggar shared from her own experience. In her account, she didn't just describe disagreements or family tension, she laid out a pattern. According to her, whenever questions were raised or boundaries were pushed, the response wasn't open discussion. Instead, it turned into pressure. Calls, messages, repeated attempts to get things handled internally, but without actually addressing what was being asked. And that's where things start to shift from just family issues into something more serious, because what she described wasn't just conflict, it was a system, one where information was tightly controlled, where people weren't really encouraged to compare notes with each other, and where stepping out of line didn't just create tension, it created consequences, real ones. There's one part of her account that really stands out. When she and her husband tried to go through legal channels to request documents they were entitled to, the reaction wasn't cooperation. Instead, it escalated. More calls, more pressure. Even other family members were pulled in, reaching out constantly, trying to convince them to drop it and move on. And when that didn't work, the situation intensified even further, with late-night visits and emotional appeals that blurred the line between concern and coercion. What makes this even more unsettling is how normalized it seemed to be for the people involved. From the outside, it's easy to see these behaviors as red flags, but inside that environment, it appears many of them didn't even question it. They had been conditioned to believe that loyalty meant compliance, that pushing back meant creating division, and that staying silent was the safest option. And this is where the bigger picture starts to come into focus, because the same patterns being described here, pressure, control, handling things privately, discouraging outside involvement, are the exact same patterns now being talked about in connection to Joseph Duggar and the situation currently unfolding around him. The idea that things should be kept in-house, that problems can be managed quietly, that public exposure is the real threat, not the behavior itself. There's also a financial layer to all of this that adds even more weight. According to what was shared, there were serious questions about money: who earned it, who controlled it, and who actually benefited from it. At one point, there were claims that large amounts of income tied to the family's television success weren't distributed the way many assumed. Instead, access to that money seemed to come with conditions that included silence and cooperation. And when you put all of this together, it starts to explain why so many people are now looking at this situation differently. It's no longer just about one incident or one accusation. It's about a pattern that's been described from multiple angles over multiple years by people who were actually inside that environment. What's really striking is how quickly narratives can be shaped in situations like this. Almost immediately, when something serious comes out, attention shifts. The focus isn't always on the issue itself, it often turns toward discrediting the person speaking up. That's something Jim Bob Duggar has been accused of doing repeatedly, redirecting the conversation, reframing the story, and making the person raising concerns look like the problem instead. And once you notice that pattern, it becomes hard to ignore, because suddenly every reaction, every statement, every attempt to control the narrative starts to feel less like damage control and more like part of a much larger system that's been in place for a long time. As more people started looking beyond the surface, another layer of this situation began to unfold. one that doesn't just involve control inside a single household, but how that influence spreads outward and affects multiple families connected to the same circle. Because what's happening here isn't isolated. The same patterns that were described by Jill Duggar are now being echoed in entirely different situations, involving different people, but following a very similar script. One of the most talked about developments involves a woman named Amy Paul, who found herself in a situation that, in many ways, mirrors what others have described. But unlike many before her, she didn't stay quiet. When her own son-in-law, Carver Bowers, was accused of serious wrongdoing, she didn't try to handle it privately or protect the family's image. Instead, she went directly to authorities and cooperated fully, even when it meant completely breaking away from the expectations of the community around her. That decision alone created a sharp contrast, because in one situation, you have families being encouraged, sometimes pressured, to keep things internal, resolve issues quietly, and avoid outside involvement. And in the other, you have someone choosing transparency, accountability, and legal action, even when it comes at a personal cost. That difference is what's now drawing attention, especially as more connections between these cases start to emerge. What makes this even more significant is how these families began interacting with each other. Amy didn't just speak out, she physically showed up. She traveled long hours to support another family, the Caldwells, who were dealing with their own situation connected to Joseph Duggar. She helped them organize, pack, and move towards safety. And that moment, families coming together, sharing information, and openly supporting one another, goes directly against the kind of isolation that had reportedly been maintained for years. Because isolation is a powerful tool. When people are kept from comparing experiences, from talking openly, from questioning what they're told, it becomes much easier to control the narrative. That's something multiple accounts have pointed out, that information wasn't just limited, it was strategically separated. People were told different things, discouraged from discussing them, and led to believe that speaking openly could create serious consequences. But once that barrier starts to break, everything changes. When Amy began working with the Caldwell family, it wasn't just about helping them physically, it was about showing that they weren't alone, and that alone can shift everything. Because the moment people realize others have experienced the same patterns, the same pressure, the same tactics, it becomes much harder to dismiss it as coincidence. There's also another important contrast here that people are starting to notice. In the case involving Carver Bowers, his own family distanced themselves completely after the allegations surfaced. There was no attempt to publicly defend or minimize the situation. But in the case surrounding Joseph Duggar, the response appears very different. Instead of distance, there are reports of unified support, attempts to question the legitimacy of the situation, and efforts to control how the story is being discussed publicly. And that difference raises a difficult question. Why are similar situations being handled in completely different ways? Part of the answer may lie in how deeply rooted the system of control is in one environment compared to another. Because when people have been raised to believe that loyalty means standing by authority no matter what, even serious allegations can get reframed. Instead of focusing on what happened, the focus shifts to protecting the family, preserving reputation, and avoiding outside scrutiny. There's also the issue of misinformation, which has played a major role in how these situations are perceived. In some cases, people have been told that charges aren't real, that investigations are exaggerated, or that everything is being blown out of proportion. And when that information is repeated enough, especially in a closed environment, it starts to shape what people believe, regardless of the facts. But what's happening now is different, because for the first time, those narratives are being challenged not just from outsiders, but from people who were once part of the same system, people who understand how it works from the inside, and who are now choosing to speak openly about it. And when that happens, control starts to slip. As these stories started overlapping and more people began speaking openly, something else became impossible to ignore: the way pressure doesn't just come directly from the top, but gets carried out through others. It's not always one person making demands or issuing threats outright. Instead, it often comes through layers: family members, close connections, people who believe they're doing the right thing. And that's exactly what Jill Duggar described in detail. When she pushed back and asked for transparency, the response didn't stop at a few tense conversations. It escalated into what she described as a coordinated effort. Calls weren't occasional, they were constant. Messages didn't just come from one direction, they came from multiple people, repeating the same idea. Resolve this quietly, don't take it further, don't involve outsiders. And when that didn't work, it turned into something more personal. Family members began showing up, spending hours trying to convince her to change course, framing it as concern, but with an underlying urgency that made it clear this wasn't optional. That kind of pressure is difficult to understand unless you look at how the system itself is structured, because in an environment where authority is treated as absolute, disagreement doesn't just feel like a difference of opinion, it feels like betrayal. People aren't just encouraged to stay aligned, they're taught that stepping outside that line could bring serious consequences, not just for them, but for everyone connected to them. And that's where fear becomes a tool. According to her account, there were moments where the pressure crossed into intimidation, not always in obvious ways, but in suggestions, in warnings, in the constant reminder that pushing back could lead to legal trouble, financial consequences, or even being cut off completely. It creates a situation where even asking basic questions starts to feel risky. What makes this even more complicated is how financial control ties into all of it. There were claims that significant money, millions tied to the family's television success, was controlled centrally, with limited access given to others. And when payments were offered, they often came with conditions attached. At one point, there was even an offer presented with a requirement to sign a non-disclosure agreement, essentially trading silence for compensation. When you look at that in context, it starts to explain why so many people stayed quiet for so long. Because it wasn't just about family loyalty, it was about stability, access, and in some cases, survival within that system. Speaking out didn't just mean conflict, it could mean losing everything familiar. And this is where the connection to what's happening now becomes even clearer, because the same approach, handling things privately, controlling who knows what, shaping the narrative early, is exactly what people are now pointing to in relation to Joseph Duggar. Early responses have included questioning whether the situation is even legitimate, suggesting that details are being exaggerated, and attempting to redirect attention toward those speaking about it rather than the issue itself. At the same time, there are reports that when outside involvement does happen, when authorities are brought in, or when families refuse to stay quiet, it's met with resistance, not always directly, but through reputation, through pressure, through attempts to reframe what's actually happening. And that contrast keeps coming back. On one side, you have people like Amy Paul, who chose to report what she knew, cooperate with investigators, and support the victim's family openly. On the other side, you have a system that, according to multiple accounts, has historically preferred to keep things internal, manage situations quietly, and avoid external scrutiny at almost any cost. When those two approaches collide, it creates tension, but it also creates clarity, because for the first time, people are seeing both sides play out in real time. They're seeing what happens when something is reported immediately and handled through legal channels, and they're seeing what happens when there are efforts to contain, redirect, or minimize. And once that comparison is out in the open, it becomes much harder to ignore the patterns that were once hidden.
By the time all of these pieces start coming together, the story stops feeling like a series of separate incidents and starts looking more like a pattern that's been in place for years. And what really stands out isn't just the control, the pressure, or even the secrecy. It's how long it all managed to stay intact without being seriously challenged. For a long time, that system relied on silence, not just silence from within the family, but silence from the wider circle around them. People didn't compare notes, they didn't question inconsistencies, and most importantly, they didn't step outside the structure that had been built. Because once you do that, once you start talking openly, once you start connecting details, that's when everything begins to shift. And that shift is exactly what's happening now. What's different in this moment is that multiple families are no longer operating in isolation. They're sharing experiences, supporting each other, and in some cases, directly contradicting the narratives that have been repeated for years. The involvement of people like Amy Paul and the Caldwell family shows what happens when that silence breaks. Instead of handling things quietly, they're choosing visibility. Instead of protecting reputations, they're prioritizing accountability. That alone changes the entire dynamic. Because systems built on control depend heavily on people staying disconnected. They depend on individuals believing their situation is unique, that speaking up will only make things worse, and that there's no real support outside of what they've always known. But once that belief is challenged, once people see others stepping forward and not backing down, it creates a ripple effect. And that ripple effect is something Jim Bob Duggar has reportedly never had to deal with at this scale before. For years, according to multiple accounts, his influence extended beyond just his immediate family. It shaped how information was shared, how conflicts were handled, and how loyalty was defined. People followed that structure because they believed it was the only way. But now, with more voices speaking out and more information becoming public, that structure is being tested in a way it hasn't been before. There's also a deeper layer to this that goes beyond just control. It's about belief systems. When people are raised in an environment where authority is tied closely to faith, questioning that authority doesn't just feel like disagreement. It feels like doing something wrong on a much deeper level. And that makes it even harder for people to step back and evaluate what's actually happening around them. But that's starting to change too. Because as more individuals begin to separate belief from behavior, they're asking different kinds of questions. Not whether they should have faith, but whether the people they trusted were actually acting in a way that aligns with what they claimed to represent. And for many, the answers to those questions are uncomfortable. What's also becoming clear is how narratives have been shaped over time. When situations arise, attention often shifts quickly, away from the core issue and towards the people speaking about it. Motives get questioned, credibility gets challenged, and the focus moves just enough to create doubt. It's a strategy that works until enough people start recognizing it. And that recognition is growing. Now, instead of accepting a single version of events, people are comparing accounts, looking at timelines, and paying attention to patterns. They're noticing how similar responses show up in different situations, how the same language gets used, and how quickly the narrative can change depending on who's being protected. When you step back and look at everything together, the accounts from Jill Duggar, the actions taken by Amy Paul, the contrasting responses between different families, and the ongoing situation involving Joseph Duggar, it paints a picture that's difficult to ignore. Not because of one single claim, but because of how consistently the same themes appear: control, silence, pressure, and now, for the first time in a long time, resistance. And once that resistance reaches a certain point, it doesn't just challenge the system, it changes it.